A Brush With is sponsored by Bloomberg Connects, the app for arts and culture. Created by Bloomberg Philanthropies, Bloomberg Connects lets you access museums, galleries and cultural spaces around the world on demand. Download the app to access digital guides and explore a variety of content. Hello, I'm Ben Luke and welcome back to A Brush With, the podcast where I talk to artists about their influences, including writers, filmmakers, musicians and of course other artists, and the cultural experiences that have shaped their lives and work. And in this episode it's a brush with Lina Iris Viktor, a Liberian-British artist who works in painting, sculpture, photography, performance and installation to create works that reflect on her own identity amid broader themes: history and geopolitics, astrophysics and maths, ancient myths and belief systems, to explore universal implications of blackness. Lina was born in 1987 to parents from Liberia in West Africa and grew up in London. She left to study in the US in her late teens, initially with the aim of working in theatre, but she switched disciplines, first to film, which she studied at Sarah Lawrence College in Bronxville, New York, and then to photography at the School of Visual Arts in New York City. Today she lives between Naples in Italy and London. As soon as she began making works of art, Lina brought together a range of materials and disparate ideas. Among her earliest pieces, for instance, was Golden Ratio, a triptych inspired by pure mathematics, visualised with a host of abstract forms and shapes inspired by the theory of the golden ratio and the spiral diagram for the Fibonacci sequence. In those works, she used 24-karat gold leaf, applied through the process of water gilding. And pure gold has been a crucial material for Lina ever since. She's interested in its visual effects, of course, but also in its historic significance and symbolic power, its ancient connections to spiritual transcendence, and its role in African cultures, for instance. She explored gold and symbolism perhaps most profoundly in her two series Materia Prima and Constellations, in which the only colour other than gold is black. Constellations are abstract canvases that teem with symbols, which, Lina says, draw again on mathematical principles and how the universe operates by pattern systems. She also likens these patterns to DNA structures, yet they also evoke textiles from a range of cultures. Again, this links to forms of information. As Lina puts it, it relates to how textile design is connected to how we, as civilizations and societies and cultures, record and transmit knowledge. In the Materia Prima works, Lina uses photographic images of herself against these black and gold patterns, with her face and upper body painted black. And you'll hear in our conversation how this idea of Materia Prima links with Lina's use of the colour black throughout her work. Over recent years, she's continued to push this balance of portraiture, linked to a host of art historical references, with rich subject matter in ambitious sequences of paintings, often displayed in dramatically coloured and atmospherically lit installations. Dark Continent is a 12-part series exploring the stereotyping and stigmatisation of Africa. A Haven, a Hell, a Dream Deferred is an 11-part body of work reflecting on Liberia's complex history and composed using the colours of the country's flag, blue, red and white, as well as black and gold, of course. And she builds on that series with In the Black Fantastic, a sequence created especially for and named after the Hayward Gallery's exhibition that opened in the summer of 2022, deepening the use of red and reflecting on a host of knowledge and belief systems, from geography to botany and astrology. And while in one work in this latest sequence the figure is absent, in the two others Lina is there, at the heart of the image, a commanding, engaging and yet elusive presence. Though she long ago abandoned her theatrical ambitions, there's an undoubted interest in performance and the adoption of roles in Lina's work. And I began by asking her about the tension between this element and a very distinct concentration on image and objecthood in her work. How does she strike this complex balance?
I think I definitely do series of works, and I have like works that are far more abstract and works that are, figurative in terms of painting. And for me, it's always about trying to merge things that may seem disparate or symbologies that are from all over the world and trying to find like a common baseline where they all work together. With the figurative works, for example, they are portraits. They're not self-portraits, but they're portraits of myself in a performative sense. And for those works, the textiles I'm usually wearing are usually, very colorful. And so what I do with the figure is I always try to bring the colors into a particular color field and then play around with the composition. And, the works are like very dense, a lot of information, a lot of tactile relief on the works. I look at it almost like an equation. And how do you put things together that works in terms of it not being abrasive to the eye, but also is still very dense with information. And so the composition is what takes, in terms of like the initial preliminary aspect of the work, the composition can take a very long time to see how it works like a puzzle, how it all fits together, to make sure that even though with all of its complexity, there's still a level of it making sense visually.
I wanted to explore that idea of self-portraiture and selfhood in the work, because you're very clear that they are not self-portraits, but you use your own body. Can you tell us about why it's important that you do use your own body and not models, for instance?
So I studied photography out of college, and I did photograph other people's subjects. I enjoy that, but there's something that's so immediate. There's a sense of like, I'm always present. There are other artists that speak about that in terms of, especially female artists that use their own body. The fact that your presence also means something as well. The fact that you can do it at any time and that your form can take on multiple kind of meanings and multiplicities kind of thing, So for me, it's about performance. It's about more of like the universal sense of like the form rather than it being self-reflexive about myself or trying to explore aspects of myself or trying to, show the audience or delve into aspects of self, like, for example, a Frida Kahlo would have done, like for me, this is not what the work is about. So it's just my being present. It's very easy to do it that way. So it's almost like a functional thing, but also from a more kind of performative aspect, there's kind of an interference that happens when you're trying to convey to somebody else what you're trying to, achieve. I've never been a good director in that way. So for me, it's like, I know exactly what I want to achieve. And so I can play endlessly with that as well. So it's like, it gives me a lot of time to get to what it is that I'm trying to achieve without like imposing that on somebody else to do,
One of the key aspects of many of the portraits is the use of black paint on your body. I wonder if you could explain the use of that paint, because it has all sorts of connotations, both in terms of art historical terms and in cultural terms. So can you explain why you do paint aspects of often the face and other parts of the body black?
I started doing that in 2015. It was very, to me, intuitive at the time. I didn't really do all the due diligence in terms of like the historical significances. It just felt very intuitively correct to do. However, obviously, I've done a lot of research since then, and blacking up, if you will, like is what it's called, right? Or doing blackface has, all these kinds of deep and sometimes very painful histories. However, what I learned, especially in the southern states of America, obviously where this was happening a lot, was that there was this also movement of black performers who were then blacking up as a retort, if you will, to the way that white people who would don blackface were ridiculing them. It was almost like turning it on its head and ridiculing them for their kind of stereotyping and lack of, worldliness and lack of understanding other people and other cultures. So there's a bit of that in it. But also for me, it's something that's also just about this idea of materia prima, right? So materia prima being first matter. And for me, it's akin to like, the stuff of the universe, the dark matter in the universe that we don't even know really what it consists of, but it looks black to the eye. And so for me, like the beginning of everything was birthed from this idea of blackness, right? And I don't mean that in the racial sense, I mean that in the universal sense. So materia prima, this idea of black being the source. And so for me, like applying that to the body is almost then taking that whole conversation to a whole nother level beyond just the blacking up, which is obviously a very societally imperative conversation, but there are bigger conversations, also more macrocosmic conversations to be had.
And there's a lot of that macro-micro in your work, isn't there, in the sense that it seems to me that there are sort of all sorts of cosmologies on the one hand, there are very specific cultural references, but there's also this tension, it seems to me, between myth and science. Tell me about that sort of balance that you're striking, because sometimes they're right next to each other in the work, as it were.
I mean, these are things I'm just interested in. I just really, mythology to me, like the way that we have told stories throughout time, the way that we have depicted the language we've used, even you talk about the pre-verbal languages that exist that are those symbologies that are so frequently used in constellations, for example. They transcend borders and they transcend time and they transcend cultures. The astrophysics is definitely not formal astrophysics in terms of like my understanding. I don't have, I'm a layman when it comes to, astrophysics, but I have a deep, I think just very intuitive understanding of the larger conversations that are happening within that field and how that can be kind of applied to art because, we live in a world where everything is so compartmentalized. And even when we went to school, there was science and math and art, and they were all very separate and not to be kind of, interwoven, because really what they're trying to do is try to explain what's going on around us, right? And empirically in the natural world, what's going on around us or how we compute those things. So yeah, for me, I think that it's like, it's almost a second nature to bring things together that seem disparate or seem that they don't belong together and have a larger conversation around them. For me, myth is, our stories that we've told since the beginning of time, again, that explains our place here, explains our relationship with the world around us, explains our relationship with each other. So to me, there really is no delineation or definition that separates those two worlds. I think they're both, at the end of the day, trying to achieve the same thing by different means.
And it seems to me that at the heart of that conversation is one of your most crucial materials, but also sort of symbols in the work, which is gold. And of course, gold has very specific references in terms of its use in contemporary society and historic society, but also it's a material from the universe, as it were. And that seems to me to be a really interesting tension in the work.
Yes, there's so many layers to conversations, like you said, about gold. There's the more kind of contemporary conversation about how we interact now with gold. And that's just mostly a very monetary conversation, very much just about wealth accretion and, all the things that kind of go along with that. However, for me, and I think artists like Yves Klein spoke about the same thing, about the inherent spirituality of gold. And that's been lost in our society. In most of our society. I wouldn't say, for example, in India, it's not lost, but like for Western cultures, that idea of gold being this conduit, if you will, like akin to this, what you would call a sun god, or like the sun. Even Western cultures for a time would place gold all through their cathedrals. I remember when I went to a cathedral in Toledo in Spain, and it was all literally, I've never seen so much gold in my life, attached to a cathedral, and obviously this is all throughout Europe and Russia and other places. So we definitely have understood that gold was, in a sense, this kind of conduit between worlds. It was meant to elicit or speak about other worlds, i.e. heaven. Or you think about the Egyptians, for example, and the ancient Egyptians, and they would bury their dead with gold. Obviously not with the intention of it being excavated and being placed in museums. So, that was, again, this conversation about the journey between worlds. That gold, I guess, was this kind of transmutive type of material. So for me, there are many different conversations. There's that conversation. Obviously, there's the much bigger universal conversation about how gold was deposited on Earth, how much gold is on Earth right now, which is not very much. The astrophysicist Brian Cox, I think, when I watched a documentary a couple of years ago, said that I think it's about 4 or 5 Olympic-sized swimming pools. That's it. That's ever been excavated. So basically, you're using a very scarce material, hence why it has the value it does. So yeah, there's that conversation too. The conversation of how gold was created in the universe during the death of a star, a supernova, and all the elements but gold's one of the last materials to be created during that implosion process. And obviously it gets ricocheted, and what we have is, what's been kind of deposited on the earth. So for me, there's so many different interesting conversations to be had around gold that I think has kind of been lost in our contemporary culture.
It also plays a really important role in the sort of physical appearance of your work, and also sort of what the work does. It seems to me that yesterday I was looking at a work which is a new work called I Bargained with My Sins and Shed My Skins, which is this abstract piece actually. Mm-hmm. But it was really clear to me that the gold's sort of transmitting from the work. It's projecting out into our space. It's owning the space around it beyond the sort of rectangle that it's contained within. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that happens in smaller ways and in different ways in all the work. Is that right? Sort of you want it to kind of have a kind of almost like a voice within the work.
I mean, I think so. When I first started working with gold, I met one of Jim Hodges' assistant, and we went to this foundry in Beacon, and he was working on these large boulders. And I think it was a gold boulder. And he said something to me that really stuck in my head. He said that when you are standing in front of pure gold, is unlike anything else. Like, you can't replicate it with fool's gold. And God knows how much fool's gold exists in the planet. But he's like, there's something very implicitly that happens in human beings when they witness real gold. Which is, again, I guess what's linking to all these conversations I had before about when they would put them in their churches and cathedrals. It's like there's something that's very otherworldly and very deeply felt by people when they see it. And so I just want to be a person that can impart that feeling and that sentiment in a way through the work. And for me, gold is its own like light source. So it emits in a way that's just so, I mean, it's like there's nothing else like it. You can't really replicate it in any other way. So yeah, for me, it's just a very special material.
So let's move on to the questions that we ask all our guests. Who was the first artist whose work you loved?
I think I was probably at 13 or 14. I went on a school trip to the Tate Modern and I saw Rebecca Horn's work, and I wrote it down because I forgot the name of it. Concert for Anarchy. And it was the suspended piano. And, you know, at the time I wasn't even interested in visual arts per se. Like, I was obviously doing more theater and performing at the time. So I just never knew that art could exist in that way, could be that, you know, could be a found object or an existing object that can be transformed. And then watching the whole process of it kind of disassembling and coming back together again, it was just magnificent. And I was like, wow, this is really, you know, blew my mind a bit.
Yeah, I'm sure it did. It's almost like it throws it up its guts over to, you know, it's extraordinary physical process, isn't it? Exactly. Yeah. So one of the things about that, of course, is that it opened up the possibility to you of a kind of a material language which was beyond the kind of obvious language of art. And that seems to me to be something, of course, you want to employ paint, but you're also, again, you know, we talked about gold, but it seems to me that you're constantly wanting to sort of involve different aspects of different materials and bring them together in a kind of collage-ish way.
Yes, I do. And materials that I don't think are very, you know, widely used. For example, the sculptures in the show with the volcanic stone. I mean, that's not something that you really find with sculptures, at least here. You find that in Mexico, but not here so much. So it did open up many windows. And, you know, since then, obviously, there's so many other things and so many other artists that, you know, work in that way where they bring together what you'd think are disparate materials to create something that's really unique and new. But yes, you know, I've always tried to, at least from my perspective, push my limits in terms of what I think can be brought together and played with from a material standpoint, from a relief standpoint, working on paper, working on canvas, and now obviously working with sculptures as well, and working also in making these like architectural kind of spaces as well. So for me, it's like, I just want to push my own limits of what I think I can do.
And in terms of the sculptures, one of the things I'm struck by when I look at them is that they seem to me to be bodies, but I don't know how deliberately that is the case.
Yeah, so I wanted them to definitely have a figurative sense without them being explicitly figurative. The idea being that, you know, they're more just about like a human-like form that is recognizable, but at the same time can't be placed. That was definitely the intention with the sculptures.
And the volcanic rock, how do you source that? Again, you know, obviously you the way that you source the gold, you work with water gilding, you're working with very specific type of gold. Tell me about the volcanic rock.
So the volcanic rock is from Sicily. So I work with a foundry in Carrara and we source that from Sicily. And it's not easy to source that material. I mean, like I said, this material, obviously volcanic rock is actually pretty abundant because it's from volcanic explosions. So you'll find it deposits all over the world in different locations. Another place you'll find a lot of volcanic rock is all over South America. And, you know, a lot of Mexican artists use volcanic rock. But in terms of Europe, the only place that we've found right now is Sicily, and it takes a very long time to get, like a very long time. and you can only get it, because unlike marble, because obviously this is a foundry that works with Carrara marble, so they can just like get huge blocks. Unlike marble, they have very specific, I guess, size limitations that they can cut to. So it's you can't really make really big sculptures with volcanic stone as well. I don't know, it's because of the nature of it being so porous. And in that way, having a fragility in that way, maybe that's why. But there definitely is a very different kind of material to work with than marble.
Which historical artist do you turn to the most today?
Right now, I'm a little bit obsessed with Fausto Malati and his Seven Sages and that whole series of work. I really like that. It kind of, now that I've said that, there's a sense of like understanding with the diviners, like that idea of like a figurative like form towering, you know. I love Sigmar Polk. I went to one of those retrospectives, I guess, at Palazzo Grassi in 2017, was it, or 2018? And the series Axial Age, the transparent black canvases, I just fell in love with those. I mean, they're amazing. I love Yves Klein, as you know, Magiro Blue, and Louise Nevelson. I'm a big fan of Louise Nevelson as well.
And there's a very important quote from Nevelson that's sort of part of the kind of foundation of your work in a way, isn't it? Yes. She says that black is the most aristocratic color of all. When I read that, it just, you know, especially coming from an artist like herself, and it not having the racial connotation, because so much when you say that, especially as a black artist, it always gets attributed with you talking about having racial conversations. But what she's talking about is that the pureness of it, and at the same time, the depth of it. I mean, I wouldn't even call it a color, I call it a value. It has so many layers within it, and people really overlook that so much. People think black is just like a very dense, mostly in art, unusable color. Most artists like are told not to use black in their work. So when you see artists like Pierre Soulages and Nevelson, and there's so many others that are dedicated to black, and all the different opacities and hues. And once you put them together, you start to see everything, where you don't see it if you just have like black in one area and then everything else is something else. When you only work with black, you begin to see black in a very different way, and you realize it has literally like all the different color spectrum within it, even though, you know, from a scientific standpoint, to say that's what white is, right? That has every single color. But for me, it's almost like I make my own kind of science. I say it's the reverse, and I say black contains everything, and it's like deeply saturated. It saturates everything. I totally understood what she said when she said that. It's an elevated color to me. Is that partly why you admire Rothko's Chapel in Houston so much? Again, it seems to me it's also about environment, yes, but also about the works themselves.
Yes, the works themselves I adore. But what really did stand out to me was the fact that you have a space that is built actually to house the works, because so often we just hanging paintings in a space that already exists, right? And you're making the work have to fit into the space. But to create a space where it's in tandem, actually it's simpatico, the architecture and the work, to me is a beautiful concept, and it's really powerful. And
whenever you've displayed your work, and right from the start really, you've always thought about it not just as individual objects but as an environment with objects sort of occupying that space, right?
Yes. So for me, like, I conceive space as a continuum of the work, and I want people, before they even engage in a close proximity to the works on the wall or however they're displayed, the sculptures, I want people to have like a feeling the minute they enter the space. Right? Like the initial just being in there, there's a sense, and then you engage with the work. So it kind of creates a mood with which then you can encounter the work.
I wanted to ask also, while we're talking about historic artists, about Cozzarelli's Libyan Sibyl in the cathedral in Siena, which has been a really crucial work, as particularly in one particular body of work, but you've used it very directly in the work, haven't you?
Yes, so in the series, A Haven, A Hell, A Dream Deferred, that series was all about America's relationship in founding of Liberia in West Africa, which is where my parents are from. I'm Liberian. So it was during the New Orleans city's tricentennial, and I wanted to make works that also spoke to New Orleanian history specifically, as well as America's general hand in the founding of Liberia. The Libyan Sibyl became this kind of like conduit or like a transmuting figure throughout the work, because the Libyan Sibyl was a prophetess of ill-fated futures. And so obviously from a, classical sense and mythological sense, that was her story. However, during the abolition of slavery, that whole story was exhumed, and so if you go to like the High Museum of Art in the States, or you go to the MoMA in many places, they have these Libyan Sibyls, like sculptures of this like very forlorn, usually laying down, her head in her hand figure, and because she's basically the arbiter of bad news. And so the abolitionists used that figure. They even likened it to Sojourner Truth, for example, as what would befall the African peoples. They used it almost, retroactively as the ill-fated, futures that would befall the African people once they were sent to America during the transatlantic slave trade. So because we're dealing with all of that history of the slave trade and then this repatriation of Black people to West Africa, I thought that would be a great, historical figure to use, because it has so much reference also to classical history and classical art, as well as contemporary stories that were happening in the Deep South in America as well. And
wonderfully, in that same series, you sort of have elements very directly drawn from West African photographers, don't you?
Yeah.
Tell us about that, because with particularly Seydou Keïta's a particular image, and you pick up not just on poses, but also on that language of backdrops. Yeah.
I've always loved Seydou Keïta. I discovered his work when I was in college, and I fell in love. And this is before I even really understood about, West African studio photography, and like Malik Sidibé and everybody else that was producing in that way. But for me, again, it comes back to this pulling from things that don't seem to make sense and bringing them together. And because they are figurative images for the most part in that series, it makes absolute sense to also draw from West African studio photography, where the figure is so imperative. And also it really recontextualized the Western view of Africa, right? When you saw those images, the fashion, the pomp, the circumstance, the regality. And I just wanted to impart some of those same notes into the work as well.
And of course, you, as the model, your figures have flowers in their hand. And that's a lovely direct reference, I thought, to Keïta.
Yeah, to Keïta and also to Ofili. So if you remember the series Within Reach in 2003 at the Venice Biennale that Ofili presented, the flowers in their hands are actually drawn from that series, from the Within Reach series. So now that we're in a show together, it's so, to me, it's just kismet. It's wow, because, I've always been so inspired by his work.
That's really interesting. Of course, one of the interesting things about, it's very neatly segued into our next question, which is about contemporary artists that you admire. But one of the interesting things about Ofili, I think, is about his sort of very programmatic or symbolic use of colour. And it seems to me that's very present in your work too.
Yes.
I wanted to ask particularly about the way sometimes, in a way, the colour comes first and then you have to form the compositions from those colours. And how easy is that? Because obviously you're not just standing there and able to grab at other colours. You're using colours as kind of almost as a ready-made, and therefore you have to bring them into play together. Tell me about that process.
I think a restricted palette gives you far more freedom in many ways. I think if you have too many options to pick from, especially with the nature of my work, because it is already so busy and dense, it would just be, I think, messy, so for me, it's about grounding in a particular color. And because colors have so much meaning to me, the blue that I was using, obviously people say Klein, I say Majorelle blue, obviously the black, restricting basically myself to only 2 colors or 3 colors or 4 colors actually makes the puzzle part of it much easier, because then it's okay, well, where does this color belong? Where does that color belong in the midst of all these, reliefs and symbols and dense kind of imagery? Where do these colors belong? It actually grounds the image.
And obviously, Ofili in that Within Reach series used colours that were related to Pan-Africanism, for instance.
Yes.
And you, in a way, you've related to that sort of Pan-Africanist ideal, but actually zoned in more on Liberia, obviously, as you say, with your background. But it's such an interesting story, why the colours are the colours they are.
What I was really trying to depict in this series is the fact that there's so much similarities between America, especially the South, and Liberia. Basically, Liberia was a sister state, to the States, and everything was based on America. So you had the American flag with 1 star, you had Monrovia was named after President Monroe, all the different districts and towns and cities were named after states and towns in America. It literally was a plantation society as well, so they architecturally built what looked like a plantation. So you really were just picking up America and placing it in West Africa as if there were some kind of tabula rasa. So I really wanted to show that kinship between the two. And the best way to do that is, the colors of America are the colors of Liberia. And so that's why within that series of work, it was all red, white, blue, obviously black, because there were earlier renditions of the Liberian flag that contained black, and also gold as well. So that was just, to me, the perfect way to visually show that relationship of how similar these two places are, even though most people have no idea of Liberian history and definitely have no idea of the fact that America founded Liberia and basically superimposed itself into West Africa.
Right. And it seems to me that what you're trying to do then is to sort of create a kind of different story within a wider project which is happening all over the world right now, which is about colonialism and decolonialism. And it seems to me that Liberia gives you access to kind of explore that very urgent topic, but through a very personal lens.
It's very personal, but also I really wanted to show, or at least impart that this is not this is the oppressor, this is the victim story, right? Because just like everything in history, it's very messy and the lines can be very blurred. So what I wanted to also speak to was the fact that, yes, of course, we can speak about, Americans, white slave owners as being the oppressor, as being the aggressor. But what happened in Liberia was that once these freed Black slaves, or those who were, children of these white slave owners, moved to Liberia, they kind of created the same system there that oppressed the indigenous peoples. So at what point does the victim become the oppressor the victim, so on and so forth. So I wanted to also show a little bit about how messy the whole thing is, because it's not so black and white the way we want to always see it, especially when we're having these conversations of colonialism. For example, people don't ever want to address the fact that Africans partook in the enslavement of their own people in many ways, because they allowed them to be taken. They allowed them to, a lot of them were sold. You think about Angola, it was happening in Angola. A lot of them were actually sold into slavery. Then they were shipped to the States or to, South Americas. So there's never this black and white, very clean issue of the aggressor and the victim, especially when you're talking about these numbers of people being sold into slavery. There's never this sense of it just being this is the good guy, this is the bad guy, in these kind of conversations.
And in terms of the way that you use the material around Liberia, obviously there are very specific maps that you used. And even when you're looking at the work, when you're looking at, for instance, the floral elements, you may be looking at more improvised elements. Those too are very directly related to historic depictions of foliage and things like that, right?
Yes. For example, when I look at the backdrop of Seydou Keïta's work, I see floral motifs, right? So those things are definitely within the work. I use a lot of fronds, a lot of botanical aspects, especially, for example, in the series like Dark Continent, but they make their way into all the works, even if they don't necessarily make sense in terms of it being like a space that would have those types of fronds and plantation within it. But just because there's always that call to the natural world, right? There's always that call to it, whether it's in a more ominous or kind of unknown way with the Dark Continent series, or whether in the new works, for example, the new triptych, they're imposed within there, but it's not within an idea of a sense of place. It's just, they are just part of the conversation around the natural world, But for me, that's always a through line as well. Even in constellations, that if you look closer, you'll see that as well. So there's definitely that through line with the work.
A Brush With is sponsored by Bloomberg Connects, the app for arts and culture. The free app offers access to more than 80 cultural organisations through a single download, ranging from Falmouth Art Gallery to Aberdeen Art Gallery in the UK, and from Anchorage Museum to New York's Governor's Island in the US. As you've heard, Lina is in the Hayward Gallery's exhibition In the Black Fantastic, and if you download Bloomberg Connects, you can explore the show further on the interactive guide to the Hayward. There you can hear audio commentaries on Lina and the 10 other artists in the exhibition by its curator Echo Eshen, and listen to a discussion between Eshen and the author Marlon James, reflecting on the ideas behind In the Black Fantastic. The guide also has sections on past and forthcoming exhibitions at the Hayward Gallery. To explore digital guides to all the partnering institutions, download the app today. It's available from the App Store and Google Play, and you can keep up to date by following Bloomberg Connects on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. Let's talk about your studio. I wanted to ask you very specifically about this because in New York you had a studio where you had a kind of white studio and a blue studio, so a kind of making studio and a kind of showing studio. Tell me about that.
So, yeah, I've always had this idea of, like I said, wanting to create a space that is evocative, that brings a certain mood. And it's really sad that studios closed now because obviously the white room was very clinical. It's very studio-esque. And then you enter into this blue room and all of the periphery of the ceiling was gilded as well. And there was very low lighting in there and very little daylight got into there. So basically it was a sense of being subsumed when you enter. the frequency of the room changes and the frequency of sound changes. Like everything changes, even though you're literally just right next door to each other. So it definitely set a tone with which then I wanted to like display these works that I was obviously like that were just kind of in interim on the way somewhere else or coming back, whatever, a space that people can have a really quiet moment and engage with the work. So yeah, for me, it's always important to have that kind of a space when you are showing work, is even if it's in your studio, like a space that is meditative.
Right. And I saw a photograph of the studio and it seemed like you had, and I think you called it a mood board, but effectively lots of works of art by other people on the walls, which acted as a kind of source of inspiration.
Yeah, so the wall that you're talking about was what I was looking at when I was making A Haven, a Hell, a Dream Deferred. So there was so much stuff. I mean, just like all kinds of images that, again, seemed kind of don't necessarily make sense, but they just made sense to me. And it was, just, again, about creating a mood. It wasn't so much about picking things from the works or anything. It just was, what do I want to be looking at? And what do I want to be thinking about? How do I want my mind to float whilst I'm working on these? And these are the visual kind of cues that I was inspired by at that time.
Let's talk about museums. Which museum or gallery do you visit most frequently?
Probably Tate Modern. To this day, I mean, there's so much to see and it just keeps growing. So for me, Tate Modern would probably be the place I go back to the most.
You grew up effectively in London for quite a while, didn't you?
Yes.
But you've lived outside of London for a lot of the time too.
Yes.
So returning to Tate Modern, does it return you to those kind of early experiences with art in a way, sort of re-triggering that excitement, if you like?
Yes. I mean, that was the first place, like I said, that I had this, interaction with Rebecca Horn's work and realizing the scope and the breadth of what art could possibly be. And so whenever I go there, I usually find that there are still, obviously they have their permanent artist rooms and spaces, and then they have their evolving exhibitions. But I always have this sense when I go there, maybe it is this sense. I mean, I didn't even think about that, about like this first encounter, but I always feel like I encounter something that, at least one thing that really just blows my mind.
Which cultural experience changed the way you see the world?
I don't know if it's a cultural experience, but it has cultural aspects. So, continuing on from what we discussed before about my growing up here, I went to a school in Kingston. It was an international school and it was a boarding school. And this is by choice. I begged my parents to go. They didn't force me to boarding school. But by the time I was 10, I was in boarding school until I was 17. And I was living with girls from about 20 something other countries. So that to me was a really, obviously when you're so young, you don't even think about how unreal that is and how most people don't have that kind of experience of, growing up with people from Saudi and from Japan and from Korea and from Mexico. But that was my experience. And we were, like sisters. We lived together all the time for the whole term. So that to me really, I think, has clarified my worldview in many ways and made me understand how things can be interconnected, how people and cultures can be interconnected, and also just how to live well with other people, from all over the world and not have these kind of stereotypes and assumptions and preconceptions. So that was something that was very prescient from a very early age about this idea of this melding of culture, melding of nationalities.
I wondered also if that gave you the sort of taste for experiencing other places as a source of kind of disruption almost in your work. Because I know you've spoken about how moving to New York was a massive disruptor. You're in Naples at the moment, and I know that was a very deliberate, conscious decision to go there and seek out different artistic forms, for instance. Tell me about that sort of disruptive nature of travel or place.
So for me, I like to be uncomfortable, at least initially, because it inspires things that you being comfortable can't do. So, I was 17 when I moved to New York. I guess by some measures that's young. And I just was obsessed with New York. And now I can't stand New York. So it's, it goes back and forth. But I was really obsessed with it. And I just knew it had something for me. And I knew that I could at least stretch and conceive of a new life kind of, there and build myself up. And obviously you're young, so you don't really know what you're going to become. So my formative years in New York were very tumultuous. It's like trying to figure out who you are in this crazy, urban environment. But yeah, to me, it's just very important to place yourself, or especially when you start to become redundant or things start to feel redundant or repetitive, to kind of jerk yourself out of something and just throw yourself into something else. And usually for me, that's just like leaving a country and just going somewhere else, whether that's through travel or literally moving. But for me with New York, I just knew it was done. In 2020, when I left, I just knew it was done. And I didn't speak any Italian, but I decided that Italy would be the next place for me to explore. And obviously from an art perspective, I mean, it's like you can't get better than being here. But Naples also is a little bit, you know, when you tell people you move to Italy and you're moving to Naples, it definitely has a certain preconception again. And like especially you talk about the north and like people living in Milan and even, you know, north of Rome, Naples does have a certain kind of connotation in Italy of being less cultured in a way. And it's funny to me because it's like, I like places that don't reveal themselves immediately, you know, and Naples has this like really somewhat dark, but really fascinating history and even contemporaneously, it's very interesting too. So I just thought Naples would be fun to be in. And so this is where I ended up, and we'll see how long it lasts.
And I know you went there sort of partly to look at ceramics. Has the volcanic rock sort of supplanted the ceramics, or is there ceramic work going on as well?
No, the first time I came to Naples, because I'm in Sorrento, which is just an hour south of Naples. The first time I came here was to see a Geopolitics building. It was 2019. It was right after the Venice Biennale. I just took a train from Venice and I came here with a friend to stay at a very particular place that Geopolitics designed here. And I just fell in love with it. And, you know, it's the perfect mix to me of like the proximity to Naples and Rome, to Carrara even is like a 6-hour drive. Everything in Italy is like, you know, so you can get there so easily. But also just, you know, the lifestyle here is just a different pace of life. And it almost feels like it's really weird coming from London where everything was so busy and intense and the exhibitions opening and all the, you know, the rigmarole around that. And coming here where nobody knows anything about you, nobody cares. It's like you literally just one other tourist and that's it. You know, it's like, I like that sense of like anonymity and almost like you have another life somewhere else.
Which writers or poets do you return to?
Jun'ichirō Tanazaki, In Praise of Shadows. That's a book I always return to. Very short book. But in parts of it, you know, he discusses like wabi-sabi, right? And like how time transforms things, how it adds things as well as takes things away, but it adds value in many ways, in ways that are not, I guess, in our cultures seem to be things that are valuable, but it adds a value when over time, when things transform. But also he spoke about gold. You know, in Japan, there's also this relationship with gold in a much more muted way. Like Kintsukuroi, how they fix their broken crockery or pots and stuff with gold and stuff. So, but he spoke about gold being in daylight or natural light, very gaudy. That gold is supposed to be viewed by candlelight, right? And that to me is something that really stuck out when I read the book the first time. And it changed my whole perspective. I was reading that whilst I was building my studio in New York, the first one. And that's why the Blue Room was so dimly lit. Because it's like the gold has to be its own light source, has to emit itself, you know. Poets, it's really a strange one. I'm sure people won't expect this, but I've always had this like deep fascination with Sylvia Plath. And when I was very young, I did a whole paper and stuff on her work, and especially Ariel. And to this day, I still recite some of her poems. I just remembered them. So like Lady Lazarus or Fever 103 Degrees, like those kind of poems. I adore her voice. Her voice is really the way that she expresses herself. I adore.
It's that extraordinary economy of language as well, isn't it? It's that precision, which I've always...
Yes, like it cuts like a knife.
Absolutely. Yeah. I wanted to ask you about Langston Hughes, because the A Dream Deferred element of that title obviously is sort of directly related to his poem Harlem, I imagine.
Yes. I mean, for me, I'm always trying to, when I'm title works, because titling to me is really important, I always want to reference people that I think the energy of their work, you know, has inspired the work that's being produced, for example. So even with the autograph show in 2019, it's a William Blake poem, Auguries of Innocence, you know. So it's Some Are Born to Endless Night, and then it's called Dark Matter. So yeah, I just always reference writers, poets, depending on the body of work, that I think there's some kind of, you know, relationship with the work that's being created.
What music or other audio do you listen to while you're working?
Contemporarily, I listen to like artists right now. Like I love Rosalia's new album. I listen to Labyrinth. I listen to Alice Coltrane. I listen to Thelonious Monk or Miles Davis. Those are like more jazz, rock. But yeah, I have a very broad spectrum. It literally is about a feeling. Like sometimes I'll just listen to nothing but 90s R&B. Like it just takes me back to my childhood, and that's what I'll be playing in my studio. So yeah, it just depends on like the vibe, what I'm feeling in the moment.
I ask this of a lot of people because I'm really conscious of it with you, in that your work, it seems to me, must have very different modes of working. There must be very detailed work in which you need to very, very carefully concentrate, and then sort of broader brush. So do you choose different music to accompany the different elements of the work?
So much of my work is spent like me hunched over a table with like a tiny plastic, very thin needle bottle, like doing all this different like detail work. And so I'm not even, honestly, sometimes I work in absolute silence, because I find like no matter what I'm listening to, my mind is not really listening to it. It's just like wandering, especially when you get to just very practical work. The music doesn't inform the work. And sometimes like even being in silence is better, because it's just the train of thought that's happening, in those moments when it's not decision making. There's a period when you're making decisions in a painting. There's a period where you're just executing. And when you're executing, that's when your mind just wanders. And so sometimes even silence is the best way,
What other media influence your work?
So film, I went to college, Sarah Lawrence, and I ended up majoring in film, which is not what they do. But I just took all these film courses, and I took a really amazing course with the late, great Gilberto Perez. And when I left college, I wanted to do film. That's what I wanted to work within. And so I remember watching like Carl Dreyer's Passion of Joan of Arc, right? Or Antonioni's L'Avventura, Wong Kar-wai's In the Mood for Love. All these movies really inspire. And I still watch these movies to this day. I just watched all of them recently. That's why they come to mind. So yes, film definitely inspires my work. And it's definitely something that I want to get back into or start to dabble back into, because it definitely was what I wanted to do initially. And then architecture is a very big inspiration for me as well.
And I just wanted to return to film for a moment. Carl Dreyer's work that you mentioned has an extraordinary relationship, of course, with portraiture, because those remarkable close-ups, it's so intense, isn't it? I wondered, would you say it's sort of directly affected the way that you work? Or is it more like a kind of a basis or a sort of foundation for ways of thinking around the work?
I mean, I wouldn't say I've consciously taken things, but, for example, like Ingmar Bergman's Cries and Whispers, right? Those reds. Like for me, I think that I'm going to be drawing very explicitly from that work sometime soon. But with Joan of Arc, I mean, the first time I watched that film, we watched it in the theater at school, obviously, and the technician forgot to put the sound on. So we watched it in absolute silence. But actually, I loved it even more in silence than I did with the score. But yes, all those really tight camera angles and pans that are really, they shake you to your core. It's very terrifying in many ways, right? Yes, I mean, I'm sure like in an unconscious way, those things have inspired the work, but I wouldn't say explicitly, no.
I wanted to ask you about dance as well, because I was really intrigued that Martha Graham and Pina Bausch influenced some of the movement that's sort of implicit in the static photography that you use.
Yes. So, the form, and like, especially when you look at like Dark Continent series works, which are far more active, the form is far more active in those works. I mean, I don't know if there's this like explicit, like I'm drawing from Pina Bausch, or I'm drawing from Merce Cunningham or Martha Graham, but I definitely look at their work all the time. So there has to be some kind of, relationship, but it's not something that I can say is probably an explicit one.
Right. But again, that relates to that sort of sense that you began your sort of creative life, as it were, thinking about performance. And it seems to me there are all sorts of ways in which performance seeps into the work, even if you're not making performance pieces, for instance. Yes.
And to be fair, I'm actually working on one of my first performance pieces now. So like live performance pieces, like I want to go into that realm furthermore than I do with performative portraits. That's what they've been up until now. It's what I grew up doing. I grew up on the stage. And to me, it's just like a natural conversation to place myself in the work again, like we were discussing, in that performative way. And then now to go further into performance works in the more traditional sense. Yeah, because it's just what I've always been interested in doing, and what I've always done from the beginning as well.
And you mentioned architecture. The way that architecture, it seems to me, is present in the work comes in multiple forms. We talked about the kind of just the setting, the kind of mood that's created by colour and things like that. But you've also created sort of freestanding screens through which the work can be conceived, can't you?
Yeah. I mean, again, the idea of space, like informing the work and vice versa, and this kind of like circular conversation, I think that I would like ideally to have. And I don't think I've achieved it yet in terms of like really knowing that there's a space that is completely simpatico with the work, right? Like you're always working with an existing space. So architecture for me, when it's successful, it sets an entire tone for your life. And I don't think people understand that because we live in buildings, like we live in these things. And yeah, you can have architecture that's really bad and actually makes you feel bad. And you have like these high rise, tiny, cube apartments in New York and even in London, and they don't make you feel good, So I think architecture is a very emotional thing. And then to have something existing within that space that is in conversation with that already emotive space, just to me is like a highly visceral experience that you can allow or impart to an audience. For example, with the screens, that was made originally for Armory in 2018. And it was, again, to like kind of break this idea of the art fair, this like white wall, like booth after booth after booth. Like, I'm not a huge fan of art fairs. So if you're going to do it, you do it like in a way that's disruptive. For example, what we did was we removed walls. So we removed the ability for you to hang work so that you essentially, as a gallery, you're losing money in the more, and it's just a money making venture, right? When you do art fairs, that's all it is. It's a money making venture. So,
how did the gallery react to that?
No, they were totally down for it. That's why we did it. It's like, let's remove some walls and let's really create this thing that from afar looks like a jewel box, right? Because it has all these gold works inside and it has this like lattice, like they were based on historically Liberian fishermen nets. So you have these lattice-like forms on these screens, so you can kind of see what's going on, but you can't get a full read of it. And so, yeah, it's just like, it was just almost like a playing around a bit, like let's just play around with the fair.
Is there a particular discipline in your daily working life that you see as an essential ritual?
Yes, I usually meditate, but I've been very undisciplined recently. It's so crazy with the show like last couple of months, so I haven't kept it up, but I usually am very disciplined about meditating every morning before I start the day.
Right. Do you do that when you get to the studio or before you get to the studio, if you like?
First thing in the morning.
Right.
First thing in the morning. It's like sets the entire tone of the day.
Right. And in those moments of meditation, I know there are different forms of meditation, but do you completely deliver yourself from the work, cut yourself off from it, or are you thinking about the work through meditation?
I mean, I think it's almost impossible to not, because the monkey mind, like it wants to return to daily things, right? It wants to return to like what you have to do. So even though you can have these moments, that's what I think meditation essentially is, just these moments of like a blank slate. But there's just, most of it is just you trying to control all those thoughts you're having or trying to stop them from coming. And in the process, yes. But you have huge breakthroughs too. It's like, I think the breakthroughs happen in meditation or like when I'm in the shower, like in these weird places, like when you start thinking about something in a different way or like a spark happens. And for me, doing meditation is definitely a moment where that can happen.
If you could live with one work of art, what would it be?
Mm-hmm. So I've never seen the sculpture, The Annunciation that Ofili did in person at the Hayward show.
Ah.
I've never seen it in person. I've only seen it like reproductions and images. And seeing it in person, I absolutely fell in love with it. I absolutely fell in love with it. So I was like, if you ask me that today, I mean, I might change my mind. I'm very mercurial. But for today, I would say that would be a sculpture I'd love to live with.
Very often the way that Chris conceives of historic and religious references, he problematizes. I mean, arguably, it's a very violent image, right?
Yes. I think a lot of people don't like that work. No, I know a lot of people don't like that work. I've read a lot of people that don't like that work for whatever reason. And it's interesting to me that he made it in 2006 and he hasn't really made many sculptures since then. Definitely very few if he has. And yeah, for me, it is a very like visceral, violent type of image. But at the same time, it has the same hypersexuality that so much of his work has as well. So it just crosses all these different boundaries of extremes of things that I think can get under people's skin, which is what makes it successful in my view.
And lastly, what's art for?
To communicate. I think that's what art is for. I think art is for allowing people to transcend their mundane lives, and this is for all of us, to think in a different way, to see the world in a different way, to open yourself up to maybe conversations or ideas that you wouldn't otherwise have in these encounters that you have. But mostly it's just a form of communication. And it's a very personal one. It's like when you stand in front of a piece of art, it's just you and that work, with the idea of the artist behind it. There's what the artist intended. There's what the artwork does. And then there's what you perceive of it. And it's unique for every single person. So it's this beautiful communication that is completely personal and subjective.
Lina, thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
In the Black Fantastic is at the Hayward Gallery in London until the 18th of September, and Rite of Passage, Lina Iris Viktor with César, Louise Bourgeois, Louise Nevelson and Yves Klein is at LGDR in London until the 17th of September. And that's it for this episode. Please subscribe to A Brush With wherever you're listening, and do give us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts. Do also subscribe to our other podcast, The Week in Art, a deep dive into the latest big art world stories, the top shows and the key issues, which is back in September. We're on Twitter at Tan Audio and on Facebook and Instagram, of course. Production, editing and sound design on A Brush With are by David Clack, and the producers of the Art Newspaper podcasts are Amy Dawson and Henrietta Bentel. Thanks also to Daniela Hathaway, and a huge thank you to Lina Iris Viktor. See you next week for A Brush With Seydou. Bye for now. A Brush With is sponsored by Bloomberg Connects. Download Bloomberg Connects today and discover cultural institutions on demand.